Welcome to the Productivity Show podcast, where we believe that you can get the important things done without having to sacrifice your health, family, and things that matter to you. My name is Tam Pham. I'm the founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life. And I'm, of course, joined by my co-host, the COO of Asian Efficiency, Brooks Duncan. How are you today, Brooks?
I'm great. We were just talking before recording that this episode is about the productivity skeptic, and I am. Some people are surprised by this. I am an Apple Watch skeptic. I've never had an Apple Watch, but we are not talking about Apple Watches, but we are talking about maybe being a little counterintuitive and being skeptics today. So I'm excited to get into this topic.
Today's episode is actually inspired by feedback that we got from a listener. One thing that we do every Wednesday when we have our meeting day, we go over feedback from people that they've submitted to us. And the feedback that we got was something along the lines of this. This person said, my only feedback would be that the barrier to entry might be a little high, particularly for people who are already efficient and motivated, but not bought in. For example, I shared a session with my wife on Outlook once. She's very organized, but also very time poor and has inbox overwhelm. And although she wants to improve that, she's generally skeptical of productivity experts. So this feedback obviously caught our attention and made us realize that, you know what, we actually know a lot of people in our lives, and we've heard from other skeptics as well that, you know what, people who might be benefiting from our material, at least should be really implementing a lot of this stuff, but are generally very skeptical of this whole productivity thing. So we thought, you know what, well, let's dedicate an episode to that. So if you have someone in your life that could use productivity help, but you haven't been able to break through or convey to them that they needed this, I think this episode is going to be really helpful for you. But if you have some other people in your life who are generally pretty efficient and organized, but you see opportunities for them to be even better at it and they don't even know about it, like what are some other things that you can do to help them? And maybe you're listening to this podcast and you're like, hey, that's actually me. I'm generally very skeptical of most productivity advice. Or maybe you've tried a lot of different things over the years and nothing has really stuck with you. If that's you, I think today's episode is going to be really helpful as well. And everything that we will mention today in the show notes will be found at theproductivityshow.com/391. And as always, we like to kick things off with our top 3 favorite resources. And the first one is a book called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. And speaking of skeptical people, Oliver Burkeman is a writer and a journalist, and he wrote this book, and he's generally known as being a skeptic of anything personal development and time management and productivity. So it's kind of funny that he wrote a book because he talks about debunking a lot of different things that are out there. But if you actually read the book, which Brooks has done, you start to uncover that a lot of the material that he proposes is actually stuff that we propose here at Asian Efficiency. So go check out that book. We'll have it linked in the show notes. And the second resource I want to recommend is another book called The 40-Hour Work Year by Scott Fritz. So not The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss, but the 40-hour work year. So working 40 hours in a year. And this book is really about how to build your business to run without you, or at least for you to work on it maybe 40 hours a year. So I highly recommend you check that one out. And then the third one is an app called Rise Sleep, both available on Android and iOS. And it's basically like a sleep optimizer. So it can import and track your sleep, but also make suggestions of how you can optimize your sleep and what parts of the day that you are most energetic and focused and when you are not most energetic and focused. And it can actually schedule stuff for you as well. I've been using this app recently, and I talked to the co-founder who might be coming on a podcast, and I really enjoyed it that I wanted to recommend it here as well. So next week's episode is about Evernote. And one interesting fact is that they had the highest revenue ever last year. And we went, wait, what? So we're going to be discussing how that happened and why Evernote is still a hot thing today, even though you might not be thinking that's the thing. So let's start diving into today's content here. So we have 3 tips for the productivity skeptic, even if that is you. And the first thing that I would recommend is that you skip the hacks and go higher level. I've been working with my personal trainer for about like 4 years now. And I remember when we first started working out, we talked about obesity, we talked about like losing weight. And I asked him, like, hey, how do you actually lose weight? What's your philosophy on this? And one thing that he brought up with me is that, he said, Tan, nobody gets overweight in a week. It's a process that happens over many months, sometimes even years. And it's the small choices of overeating over time that lead to people being overweight. It doesn't happen overnight or over a week. It happens over a span of months or years. In the same vein, it's also unrealistic to lose a lot of weight very quickly. Just like how you slowly added weight, you also have to slowly lose it as well. So what I suggest you do, Tan, is that you forget about the diet hacks and just focus on the big areas, which is eating in a deficit, moving more, and doing it consistently over time. But the thing is, nobody likes to hear that. And when I remember when he said that to me, I go, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like you don't gain like 50 pounds in 1 week. It happens over a long period of time. Likewise, you don't lose that weight immediately as well. But most of us don't like to hear that. We want to lose, 10 pounds in 7 days, right? We want to, follow the latest fad or the latest diet that promises that we can do all these amazing feats. But in reality, what we really want to do is actually lose it very slowly so we don't lose our lean mass and tissue, which is so important, especially when you start working out. And the same is true for productivity as well. People don't want to hear that saving a few minutes here and there is the way to go. They want, 5 hours right away. Like within 3 days, we have to have an extra 5 hours in a week. And it sounds kind of cool and sexy, but the reality is the small wins done consistently over time will actually get you there more consistently and in a much more effective way than making a drastic change at once, which is typically unsustainable. And if you ever attended one of our live trainings, we talk about this quite a bit. But I know you might be listening and you might say, well, it's kind of hard to convince people of, implementing keyboard shortcuts, having email filters, having all these little things optimized so that it leads to these big things over time. It doesn't sound that great and doesn't sound that appealing. So I totally get that. So instead of trying to convince them, go the other direction, go high level, right? And at Asian Efficiency, we're known for the T framework, which is time, energy, and attention. We call it the T framework for that reason. And if you are brand new to us, you can go to asianefficiency.com/T or theproductivityshow.com/T, and you'll find resources there as well to kind of learn about what we stand for and how this productivity framework is so helpful. But the basic idea is anyone that wants to be more productive can optimize one of those 3 areas: time, energy, and attention. So once you know what the area is that you should focus on, you'll start to see all these opportunities to be more productive, to be more efficient, and to be more effective.
Yeah. And that's the thing, like people can really intuitively understand that focusing on one of these buckets can help, even if they, even if they don't believe the bottom up changes work, but just like people can kind of get, focusing on my time would help, focusing on my energy would help, focusing on my attention would help. And it's all almost like a way to draw people in. And then once they're drawn in, once they agree, like, yeah, these high level buckets, it does generally make sense, then they'll be more, potentially, they'll be more receptive to finding out things they can do to implement and improve that general bucket. I know for me, I kind of went through this when it came to, and this is going to sound really weird, but when it came to naps, right? Talk a million times on the productivity show about naps. You read about it all the time, how helpful they are if one is able to take it. Not everybody is. And I always like self-identified as not a nap person. I would always, if somebody were to talk about naps, I'd be like, yeah, I actually end up feeling worse after. It's not really for me. So I always just like completely rejected that advice out of hand. However, last year, I've talked about on the podcast, last year, I decided that I was going to go the other way, go high level and go down, and decide I was going to focus on energy last year. And that kind of led me to, well, I'll try different things to improve my energy. And I was like, well, if I'm trying to improve my energy, might as well try this on a consistent basis for a while and see how it goes. And it's made a really, really big difference for me. So that's a perfect example of how I always rejected the the advice that every productivity person says. But because I went the other way, I went high level and the other way, it actually made a big difference for me. So like we said, skip the hacks and go more high level.
So before we move on to tip number 2 here, I do want to give a shout out to all of our Productivity Show Plus subscribers. And if you don't know what this is, we have a upgraded version of the podcast called TPS Plus. And this is where you get our episodes ad free. So there's no advertisements or sponsorships there. You also get them a little bit earlier. And you also get a few bonus courses along the way as well. Plus, if you become an annual subscriber, you get an exclusive t-shirt that says 1 tweak a week, which has been really popular. And so I want to give a shout out to all of our TPS Plus subscribers here. And if you're interested in becoming an upgraded member of the podcast, you can go to theproductivityshow.com/plus. So thanks to everyone who has signed up so far. And Brooks, what is tip number 2 here for the productivity skeptic?
Yeah, I just noticed we had a bunch of new members coming in, so really, really appreciate that. Tip number 2 is to help people focus on what they can do and worry less about everything else. I know for me, one time I attended the annual conference of the National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals, something I used to go to every year. And I was sitting in this session presented by a productivity consultant. I'm actually not going to say who it is because they've been on the podcast before. But anyway, they were leading the audience through this exercise. And what they did is they asked them to list everything that they could think of that they had to do in their work and personal life, basically their entire to-do list. And the idea behind that exercise, just so you know, is the idea is you get it all out and then you like look at what you can do to start tackling it. But it was very interesting for me as I was sitting there kind of observing this, is that you could just completely feel the energy in the room deflate and almost get hostile. I actually felt really bad for the speaker because people just like putting a focus on everything they had to do was just like totally turning them negative and skeptical. And these are all like productivity consultants and people who are supposed to be into this stuff. And I was thinking to myself as I was sitting there, why are people having this reaction? And I think it's because when we think about everything, like absolutely everything we feel that we want to do or feel that we should do, it can be really, really deflating because we never feel like we're doing enough. There's always, one more task to do. There's always one more project to start. There's always one more activity that your neighbor's kids are doing that yours aren't, that you could be signing your kids up for. There's always one more relationship that you could be nurturing or building. Like it's just never, ever enough. And this is really, really true, I find, because a lot of our real or our mental to-do list is just never going to happen if we're really, really honest. And I think that was the point of the exercise that the speaker was trying to do, is that, it's not about bucketing and prioritizing. It's just like understanding that a lot of this stuff is just never going to happen. So we're really stressing about things that there's just no way that we can do anything. And this is one of the reasons why we wanted to have that 4,000 Weeks book in the top 3 resources, because it talks about this a lot. It recommends facing the hard truth that we really are just not going to get everything done. So instead of like killing ourselves trying and beating ourselves up about it, why not instead focus on what we can do? And we wanted to talk about this in the context of this episode, the Productivity Skeptic episode, because this realization can really help productivity skeptics who may have tried to do some of the usual productivity advice, like eat your frog and all that sort of stuff. They may have tried to do some of this stuff, but just thought, nothing ever works. I've tried a bunch of stuff and I still feel just as stressed as I did before. So forget it. So what the book recommends, and I think what we can recommend too, is focusing on accepting that we're not going to be able to do everything, but instead then asking yourself, okay, what is important to you? And then using a fixed strategy. So say have 5 things going on at any one time that you're going to focus on. And if you want to try something new, something on that list has to go. So you're going to say to yourself, okay, I have 5 things that I'm giving my focus to right now. And it could be 3, it could be 10, whatever works for you. And then just focusing on those things. And if something else comes in, because that happens, right? Your boss comes to you and say, hey, I need you to do something, then that's fine. But then you've got to decide what of the other 5, 10, or 3 things on your list are you going to suddenly not focus on. And this is something we've actually been talking about on the podcast for a long time, is this concept of intentional imbalance, right? Trying to get it all done, trying to have a like a pure work-life balance, trying to get everything done, it just is not going to happen. So way back in TPS139, we talked about this concept of intentional imbalance. And basically what you need to do is decide what you're going to focus on and what you're going to do less well. So what can you let slide a little bit to give more attention to other things? And once you kind of like make this realization and accept it, it's actually really freeing, because you can't do everything. So it's then deciding what you can do. So this is something we recommend for anybody, but particularly for productivity skeptics who have been told that you can do everything.
Oh, that's the biggest fallacy that I think is out there, thinking that you can do everything. And the reality is, even if I look at my own productive days, the most productive day I have consistently are the days when I do 3 things and I complete them. If I can accomplish 3 things that are moving things forward, then I would consider that a really productive day. And if we want to, for example, measure that in time, I think one thing that's really realistic for most people is to say, hey, if you have 90 minutes a day of uninterrupted time to focus, that is considered a very productive day as well. So the fact that we might have 5, 10, 15, 25 things on our list is just unrealistic. And so another way to think about this is, if you have a long to-do list, how can we, quote unquote, prioritize it so that you start to work on the things that are important to you? And what's important is maybe not an easy question to answer for yourself. Maybe it's something related to a goal. Maybe it's a project that you feel very passionate about. But if you don't know what's most important to you, then that's the first thing you have to figure out, because that leads to everything else that you need to do then. So be sure to be clear on what that is, and so that you can focus on the things that you can control. Because I'm reminded of this all the time by my sports psychologist. Once we start focusing on things that we can't control, it leads to a lot of stress. And in fact, it is unnecessary stress, because we can't change certain things or certain circumstances. Just like the fact that we can't get everything done without the realization that we go, you know what? If we try to do everything that's on here, you might, be 75 years old. And by that point, what's the point of having accomplished all these different things, especially if it's things that don't matter, right? So we want to make sure we're always focusing on what we can control and focusing on the things that matter to us.
All right, so that's tip number 2, help people focus on what they can do. Tip number 3 is to help them focus on their strengths and not try to fix weaknesses. Back in my corporate days, I used to have this email organization system that worked pretty well for me. I was a big fan of it. I don't use it totally anymore, but I was a big fan of it and evangelizer of it back then. And I used to sometimes bug my coworkers to try it, because it would annoy me when they couldn't find something that they needed to help a customer, or maybe I asked them for something and it took them a while to find it or whatever. So I would always try to get people to use my email organization systems. And really that was a complete flop. It just didn't work. But what did work is teaching them just some simple tricks for searching Outlook, which back then needed a special plugin. You don't need to anymore. But just teaching them a few simple tricks that they could use that would help them, versus trying to get them to adopt my system. And that way they could keep organizing or not organizing, as the case may be, however they wanted. I wasn't trying to get them to use my system, but now they had a helpful tool available when they needed it. And if you think about it, there's a lot of different types of people in our work and personal life, or maybe a lot of us are this way, right? There's people who are super, super unproductive and super disorganized, or there's people who are really, really productive and really, really organized. But the tricky part is like the example we referenced at the beginning of the episode, one of our listeners' wives, who they're the in-between people, right? The people who are generally efficient, generally organized, and otherwise pretty high functioning, but maybe have some productivity holes. And they might be resistant to a lot of productivity advice because they feel like what they're doing is generally working pretty well, right? They're just like, oh yeah, it works for me, it's fine. Even though maybe the rest of us might not feel that it works as well as they think it is anyway. And the key, I think, is instead of telling them to stop doing something or to implement some big system, it may be more successful to just give them some simple things to start with that can make what they're already doing more successful, and then they can kind of like build from there. So instead of trying to get somebody who has 15,000 emails in their inbox to get organized, like I said, maybe just teach them something similar, like simple, like maybe just teach them something simple like how to search by sender. Or instead of trying to get somebody to use GTD or use a task manager like Microsoft To Do or OmniFocus, instead just help them write their top 3 tasks for the day on a piece of paper and just leave it at that. Or maybe instead of trying to get somebody not to overschedule their Outlook, like maybe you notice that their Outlook just looks like a wall. Instead of like trying to get them to stop doing that, help them schedule a little buffer block on their calendar to take care of those little things but important tasks that they never have time for. So just start helping them do what they're doing already, but maybe improving it a little bit. And then if they're interested from there, it can kind of go from there, but you're going to be a lot more successful doing it that way.
I love it, Brooks. And to conclude today's episode here, as always, here at the Productivity Show, we want to make sure that you end with an action item that you can take. So what I recommend you do next is start with the T framework. So go high level. It's the first step that we talked about. Help people, maybe that is you, focus on time, energy, or attention, and then go from there. So what's the high level area that we can focus on first, and then dive deeper from there. Again, next week's episode is about Evernote, what's new and where things are and what you can expect going forward from them. And everything that we mentioned today will be in the show notes. So go to theproductivityshow.com/391. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next Productive Monday.